July 9, 1944, 11:42 a.m., St. L, Sector, Normandy. The earth shuddered from an impact that felt less like a sound and more like a sharp displacement of the air itself, knocking the breath out of lungs. 30 tons of American steel, an M4 Sherman tank under the command of Lieutenant Michaels, roared as it crawled up the earthen embankment, attempting to overcome an obstacle that looked on maps like a thin green line. But this wasn't just a hedge. This was the Bocage, a 1,000-year-old wall of compressed earth, stone, and intertwined oak roots, 1.5 meters thick and taller than a man. The tank's tracks spun furiously, tearing out chunks of sod, while the Ford GAA V8 engine screamed at the limit of its 500 horsepower, choking on overheating. The tank pitched its nose up at a 35-degree angle, exposing its most vulnerable point, the underbelly, protected by a mere 12 millimeters of armor. At that moment, just 30 meters away, in the dense shadow of blackberry bushes, a German grenadier squeezed the trigger of his disposable Panzerfaust 60 anti-tank launcher. The cumulative jet, superheated to 3,000 degrees Celsius, struck the exposed belly of the Sherman at supersonic speed. There was no heroic duel, no chance for a return shot. The thin metal of the floor evaporated instantly, turning into sprays of molten death that filled the fighting compartment faster than the crew could realize they were dead. The ammunition rack of 75-millimeter shells detonated 0.8 seconds after impact, ripping the 12-ton turret off its ring and tossing it 5 meters away like a plastic lid. Sergeant Curtis G. Culin watched this fireball through the periscope of his tank, second in the column, and felt cold sweat trickling down his back under his wool shirt, soaking his uniform with the scent of fear and diesel fuel. He wasn't an MIT engineer. He wasn't a West Point strategist. He was a 29-year-old guy from Cranford, New Jersey, who had worked as a traffic cop before the war and loved tinkering in his garage. But he didn't need a college degree to understand the simple and terrifying arithmetic that was killing his friends. Every time a tank tried to climb over these damned hedgerows, it turned into a defenseless turtle, flipped on its back. The American Army, the most mechanized force in human history, had been halted not by Nazi superweapons, but by bushes, ordinary French bushes. "Back! Back up, damn it!" Culin screamed into the intercom, his voice cracking with tension, drowning out the crackle of Lieutenant Michaels' burning ammo cook-off. The driver jerked the levers, and their tank lurched backward, disappearing behind the bend of a narrow road that looked more like a green tunnel of death. By mid-July, the situation in Normandy had turned into a bloody stalemate that threatened to derail all the achievements of D-Day. The Allies had landed a month ago, but had advanced only a couple of dozen kilometers inland. The terrain, called the Bocage, was a chessboard of tiny fields, each surrounded by earthen walls created by the Romans and reinforced by centuries of farming. Tree roots were woven with stones so tightly they stopped bullets, shrapnel, and even 30-ton machines. For the German defense, it was paradise. Every square was a ready-made fortress, every road a ready-made ambush. Americans were losing 100 tanks a week, advancing at a snail's pace, paying for every meter with blood. That evening, at the bivouac of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, the atmosphere was heavier than the air before a storm. Men sat silently, staring into mugs of cold coffee, their faces covered in a mixture of soot and dust that had seemingly embedded itself into their pores forever. Culin, wiping the bolt of his M2 Browning machine gun with an oily rag, listened to the conversation of two officers standing by a map spread out on the hood of a jeep. "We can't get through," the captain was saying, stabbing his finger into the map so hard the paper bowed. Engineers tried explosives, but it takes time. While they set charges, snipers pick them off one by one. Bulldozers are too slow and unprotected. We are stuck. If we don't break through these hedges, the Germans will simply regroup and push us into the sea. Culin set the machine gun aside. A thought was spinning in his head, simple and obsessive as the sound of a broken bearing. The problem wasn't the armor or the caliber of the gun. The problem was the physics of motion. When a tank drives over an obstacle with its tracks, the center of gravity shifts back, the nose lifts, and the vehicle loses traction, hanging on its belly. They didn't need to climb over the obstacle. They needed to go through it. "Sergeant, are you listening to me?" The voice of Lieutenant Steve Roberts snapped Culin out of his thoughts. "Yes, sir. I was thinking about teeth." "About what?" Roberts frowned, his face expressing extreme fatigue. "Teeth, sir. If the tank had teeth, huge tusks on the front, it wouldn't climb. It would bite into the earth and keep the nose down." Roberts wanted to dismiss it, but he froze. He knew Culin. He knew this guy from New Jersey could fix a Jeep with a wire and a tin can. All around them, on Omaha and Utah beaches, thousands of tons of twisted metal still lay scattered. The remains of German anti-landing obstacles, the so-called Czech hedgehogs. These were massive steel beams welded crosswise, designed to rip open the bottoms of landing craft. The cruel irony of war, what was meant to stop Americans on the water, could now save them on land. "Show me," Roberts said quietly. The next morning before dawn, Culin and his team of mechanics headed to the coast. Fog clung to the ground, hiding minefields the sappers hadn't yet cleared. The air smelled of salt, rotting seaweed, and decaying metal. Czech hedgehogs stuck out of the sand like skeletons of prehistoric beasts, covered in rust and barnacles. Each beam weighed about 200 kilograms. It was high-quality German steel, strong, rigid, perfect for killing. "Cut 'em," Culin commanded the welder, Corporal Johnson. The blue flame of the acetylene torch hissed, biting into the metal. Sparks cascaded onto the wet sand. Culin watched the process with a professional squint. He needed pieces about a meter long, sharpened at the ends like spearheads. The plan was insanely simple and simultaneously brilliant in its crudeness. Weld these pieces of steel to the front of the tank, directly to the towing lugs and the lower armor plate. It would create a kind of fork or a massive plow. Work boiled in the field workshop disguised under the thick canopy of apple trees. The sound of welding machines mixed with the distant rumble of an artillery duel. Culin personally supervised the process, his hands in rough leather gloves guiding the electrodes, creating seams that had to withstand an impact of several tons. He used steel plates to reinforce the structure, calculating the angles of attack so that the tusks would enter the earthen wall just below ground level. "Sergeant, are you sure this won't rip off our front suspension?" a mechanic asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "If we don't try, Hans will rip off something else with his .88 caliber," Culin grunted without lifting his protective mask. By noon on July 14th, the first prototype was ready. It was an M5 Stuart light tank, now looking like an enraged mechanical rhinoceros. 4 massive steel teeth protruded from the front, predatorily gleaming with fresh metal cuts. Culin called the device the Rhino, but the soldiers immediately christened it the Culin Hedgerow Cutter. The test was scheduled for a nearby field where a pristine section of hedgerow remained. Rumors of the crazy sergeant and his monster tank reached headquarters, and General Omar Bradley himself, commander of the U.S. First Army, arrived to watch the test. His jeep stopped at a safe distance. The general stepped out, his eyes behind glasses carefully studying the strange contraption. Bradley was a man of numbers and logic. He knew that Operation Cobra, the massive breakout from Normandy, was scheduled in 2 weeks. If they didn't find a way to move faster, the offensive would choke on blood. Culin climbed into the hatch of the Stuart. Inside, it smelled of oil and hot metal. He put on his headset and signaled the driver. "Come on, Johnny. Show them what this pile of scrap can do. Full throttle." The engine roared, and the 15-ton machine jerked forward. The tank picked up speed, 15, 20, 25 kilometers per hour. The green wall ahead approached with terrifying speed. Every tanker's instinct screamed, "Brake! You'll crash!" But Culin ordered him not to slow down. The impact was terrifying. Metal screeched as it met stone and roots. The tank shuddered through its entire hull, and Culin was thrown forward, seatbelts cutting into his shoulders. The spectators, including General Bradley, instinctively recoiled, expecting the machine to fly nose up as usual. But that didn't happen. Instead of climbing the wall, the steel tusks bit into the base of the embankment. The force of inertia and the power of the engine pushed the tank forward, and the Rhino literally sliced through the lower part of the hedge. Earth, roots, bushes, and stones flew into the air, parting before the steel onslaught. The tank passed through the obstacle without slowing down, remaining perfectly horizontal. Its cannon pointed straight ahead, ready to fire, its belly remaining safely covered by the ground. 3 seconds later, the tank was on the other side, leaving behind a smooth breach 3 meters wide. General Bradley stood motionless for several seconds, then slowly removed his pipe from his mouth. He turned to his aide. "How many of these things can we make?" he asked quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "As many as we can find metal for, sir," the aide replied. "Gather every scrap on the coast, tear down the barriers, dismantle German bunkers. I need every tank in the First Army equipped with this device. You have 1 week." It was an order of impossible scale. The Army had over 1,500 Sherman and Stuart tanks preparing for the breakout. Culin, an ordinary sergeant, suddenly found himself at the center of the largest field modification in the history of World War II. Night turned into day from the light of hundreds of welding torches. Maintenance companies worked 20 hours a day. The beaches of Normandy were stripped clean of German obstacles. Now enemy steel would serve the liberation of France. But the joy of technical success was short-lived. The reality of war quickly reminded them of its presence. On July 20th, 5 days before the start of Operation Cobra, intelligence reported that the Germans noticed activity in the American rear. They didn't understand exactly what was happening, but the sound of metal and flashes of welding made them nervous. German artillery began methodically shelling the repair workshops. At 02:02 a.m., a 105mm shell exploded 10 meters from the tent, where Culin was calculating blueprints for mounts on a heavy M4A1 tank. The blast wave threw him onto the table, covering him with dirt and wood splinters. He spat out dust, checked his arms and legs. Intact. Outside, someone was screaming, "Fire! Oxygen tanks!" Culin ran out. One of the trucks carrying welding equipment was burning, flames licking toward the compressed oxygen cylinders. If they blew, half the maintenance battalion would vanish, along with the Army's only hope for a breakout. Culin didn't hesitate. He jumped into the cab of the burning truck. The steering wheel scorched his hands, even through gloves. The engine coughed but started. Clenching his teeth so hard it felt like they would crack, he stomped on the gas pedal and steered the vehicle away from the camp toward a ravine. Flames licked the windshield. The heat became unbearable. 50 meters, 100 meters. He jumped from the cab while moving, rolling across the ground just a second before the truck tumbled into the ravine. A blinding flash lit up the night, followed by a monstrous explosion that seemed to split the sky in half. But the camp was intact. The work could continue. By the morning of July 25th, the day Operation Cobra began, more than 60% of the First Army's tanks, nearly 1,000 machines, were equipped with Culin cutters. Crews looked at their ugly, rough-seamed machines with hope. For the first time in a month, they felt they had a chance. But no one had tested these devices in real combat yet, under massive fire from POC-40 anti-tank guns and Panther tanks. Proving ground tests are one thing. The chaos of battle, where metal is tested for strength not by earth but by armor-piercing shells, is quite another. Would the weld seams, made in haste by tired mechanics in the rain, hold? Would the tactic work? At 09:38 a.m., thousands of engines roared simultaneously. The earth trembled. Operation Cobra had begun. Culin, inside his command tank, looked at the endless line of hedgerows before him. Behind those bushes waited the elite of the Wehrmacht, the Panzer Lehr armored division. They were confident the Americans would crawl slowly along the roads again, exposing themselves to the strike. They didn't know a tsunami of steel capable of walking through walls was coming for them. "Forward!" Culin commanded. His tank picked up speed and slammed into the first barrier. Impact, darkness before his eyes, the screech of metal on stone. And then light hit his eyes. It wasn't the light of an explosion or the flash of death the crew expected. It was sunlight from the other side of the hedgerow. Sergeant Culin's rhino didn't rise into the air. It didn't expose its thin 12-millimeter belly. Instead, with the monstrous sound of tearing earth and breaking timber, the 30-ton machine passed through the ancient rampart like a hot knife through butter. 4 steel tusks, cut from German trash, did what tons of explosives and months of planning could not. The tank flew onto the battlefield perfectly level, its 75-millimeter M3 gun looking straight into the faces of stunned German soldiers. The element of surprise was absolute, paralyzing, lethal. The crew of a German 75-millimeter PAK-40 anti-tank gun, camouflaged in the opposite corner of the field, froze. They expected the American tank to slowly crawl over the embankment, exposing its bottom, as had happened hundreds of times before. They waited for an easy target. Instead, a steel monster emerged before them in a cloud of dust and flying roots, already firing. The Sherman's gunner pressed the firing pedal for the coaxial machine gun before the tracks even touched level ground. "Fire! High explosive!" Culin screamed into the intercom. The shell left the barrel at 619 meters per second. The distance was laughable, less than 120 meters. The explosion turned the German gun and its crew into a bloody mess of twisted metal and human flesh before they could even load a shell into the breach. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. And it wasn't happening in just one place. Across a front line 6,000 meters wide, hundreds of tanks were simultaneously smashing through walls the Germans considered impregnable. "They are coming through the walls! They are walking through walls!" This panic-stricken cry on the German radio network became the leitmotif of the morning of July 25th, 1944. The next 6 hours turned into a mechanized slaughter unlike anything Normandy had ever seen. The tactic developed by Culin and General Bradley was simple but devastating. A tank with a cutter punched a hole in the hedgerow, making a passage 3.5 meters wide. Following it into the breach rushed the infantry of the 29th Division, shielded by armor from machine gun fire. Once in the field, the tank suppressed firing points with high explosive shells and white phosphorus, while infantrymen cleared foxholes with grenades and bayonets. At 13:15, Sergeant Culin led his company through a sector south of the Saint-El-Périllet Road. The terrain here was particularly difficult. Fields were small, no more than 100 meters long, turning each patch into a closed box of death. But now these boxes became traps for the Germans themselves. Culin spotted a camouflaged Panzer IV waiting in ambush at a crossroads. The German commander made a fatal mistake by orienting toward the road. He couldn't guess that the attack would come from the flank, through a solid earthen wall 2 meters thick. Culin directed his driver straight at the hedge, perpendicular to the enemy's position. Impact, screech, lurch. The Sherman burst into the field 50 meters to the side of the German tank. The Panzer's turret began to turn slowly, too slowly. The German turret's electric drive was sluggish, whereas the Sherman's hydraulics allowed a full rotation in 15 seconds. Armor-piercing, target, flank, fire! The 75-millimeter slug slammed into the side of the German tank, where the armor was only 30 millimeters thick. The shell punched through the vehicle, triggering an ammo detonation. The Panzer's turret jumped, spewing a column of flame 10 meters high. "Next!" Culin commanded, giving the crew no time to celebrate. By 16 that same day, the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, nicknamed Hell on Wheels, had advanced 5 kilometers deep into German defenses. 5 kilometers in 4 hours. That was more than they had covered in the previous 3 weeks of bloody fighting. Mechanics who had welded rusty beams at night in the rain now saw the fruits of their labor. Tanks weren't burning, tanks were moving forward. But the enemy wasn't going to surrender without a fight. The elite Panzer Lehr Armored Training Division under Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlin was perhaps the best Wehrmacht unit on the Western Front. Bayerlin, a veteran of the Afrika Korps, was used to maneuver warfare, but what was happening now didn't fit any tactical schemes. His forward observers reported ghost tanks appearing from nowhere. At 17:45, Bayerlin received a report from the commander of the 902nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment. "American tanks are attacking us from the rear. They are not using the roads. Repeat, they are not using the roads. They are cutting the Bocage like paper. Our anti-tank positions are bypassed and destroyed." German defense was built on holding key crossroads and roads. When the Americans started moving straight across the fields, the entire Wehrmacht fire system collapsed. The Germans tried to regroup, pulling their Panthers and Stugge self-propelled guns back to a second line of defense, but it was too late. Sergeant Culin and his crew encountered this attempted counterattack at sunset near the village of Gilbert. 3 German Stugge 3rd assault guns were trying to take position behind a stone farm. Culin saw them through the dust raised by hundreds of tracks. He had only 12 armor-piercing shells left. Fuel tanks were half empty, and the crew had been running on pure adrenaline for 12 hours straight. "Johnny, see that barn? Go through it." Culin's voice was hoarse but calm. "Through the barn, Sarge?" "Yeah, walls are thin. It'll give us an angle." It was madness, but Culin's cutter had already proven that madness works. The tank crashed into the wooden wall of the old French barn. Beams shattered into splinters, the roof collapsed behind them, but the tank burst out the other side, ending up right in the rear of the German assault guns. Range 40 meters. Shot. The first Stoogie erupted. The second began to turn, crushing a fence with its tracks. Shot. The shell ricocheted off the frontal armor, but a third shot, aimed under the gun mantlet, silenced the machine forever. The third assault gun, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, reversed and disappeared into the smoke. 532nd confirmed division target for today, the radio operator noted, wiping soot from his face. By the end of July 26th, 36 hours after the start of Operation Cobra, the front was breached across a width of 10 kilometers. American troops broke out of the Bocage labyrinth into open country. General Byerlin, whose Panzer Lehr division was considered invincible, sent a message to Army Group B headquarters that would go down in history. "My division is annihilated. No tanks, no artillery, no men. I am alone." Of the 190 tanks and assault guns Byerlin had before the operation, fewer than 40 remained combat capable by the evening of July 27th. An American amateur welder from New Jersey, using scrap metal, had done what carpet bombing could not. A week after the breakout, when the dust had settled slightly, Sergeant Culin was summoned to the 1st Army headquarters. He drove there in the same dusty Jeep, in greasy fatigues, still not fully believing what was happening. Inside a large tent hung with maps, not only General Bradley was waiting for him, but also General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces. "Sergeant," Eisenhower said, extending his hand, "I have been informed that thanks to your invention, we have saved at least 4,000 American soldiers' lives this week. That is more than the strength of an entire regiment." Culin stood at attention, feeling uncomfortable under the general's gazes. "I just wanted my guys to come home, sir," he replied. It wasn't false modesty. It was the truth of a man who had seen too many burning tanks. That same day, he was awarded the Legion of Merit. It was an incredibly high honor for a sergeant, usually reserved for senior officers for strategic achievements. But Culin had achieved a strategic breakthrough using a welding torch. However, the war wasn't over, and it had a cruel sense of humor. The hero of Normandy, the man who gave tanks teeth, wasn't sent home to sell war bonds. He stayed in the line. He stayed with his crew. 4 months later, in November 1944, in the gloomy and cold Hurtgen Forest, where trees were shredded by artillery shells at man height, Culin's luck ran out. He stepped on a German S-mine known as a Bouncing Betty. The explosion blew off his left leg below the knee and peppered his face with shrapnel. The man who saved thousands of lives lay on the frozen German earth, bleeding out, while medics fought their way to him through mortar fire. He survived, but his war ended in a hospital, amidst the smell of carbolic acid and the groans of the wounded, many of whom were alive only thanks to his invention. The statistics of Operation Cobra and the subsequent breakout through France are staggering. In the first 6 days of the offensive, using tanks with Culin cutters, American troops captured over 20,000 prisoners. Tank losses, which previously ran up to 40% in every attack, dropped to 10%. The speed of advance increased from a pitiful 200 meters a day in the Bocage to 30-40 kilometers a day in open terrain. Over 2,000 Sherman and Stuart tanks and M10 tank destroyers were equipped with Rhino devices by August 1944. About 500 tons of German steel, scavenged from beach obstacles, were used for their production. The enemy literally armed the army that destroyed him. After the war, Culin returned to New Jersey. He didn't become a famous inventor or a wealthy industrialist. He worked in sales for a trucking company, lived in an ordinary house, and raised children. He wore a prosthesis that rubbed his leg raw on hot days and rarely spoke about the war. But every year, on June 6th, he received letters. Dozens of letters from strangers, farmers from Ohio, clerks from Chicago, teachers from California. All of them wrote the same thing. "Thank you. I am alive because my tank went through a wall." The legacy of his crazy idea lives on today. Look at modern main battle tanks, the M1 Abrams, Leopard 2, Challenger. Many of them, especially in urban conflict zones or difficult terrain, are equipped with add-on dozer blades or mine plows. The concept of changing a tank's geometry to overcome physical obstacles, born in the mind of a tired sergeant in Normandy mud, became a standard of military engineering. The story of Curtis Culin isn't just a story about a piece of iron welded to another piece of iron. It is a lesson that in the darkest hour, when technology is powerless and generals are at a dead end, the solution can come from a simple man with dirty hands who refuses to accept the word impossible. He proved that sometimes to defeat the most powerful army in the world, you don't need secret laboratories and billion-dollar budgets. You need rusty German scrap metal, a welding torch, and the courage to try what others consider madness. If you were blown away by the story of how a simple welder changed the course of World War II, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. We find and tell stories like this every day, and you definitely won't want to miss the next video about forgotten heroes who made history with their own hands. See you tomorrow.